buried up to her chin in a riverbed at low tide. A cowboy beat the tide and gave her solid ground forever. The rope was still wet when I coiled it. I remember that. The weight of it waterlogged and heavy in my hands, the smell of river mud on everything, my boots, my shirt collar, the inside of my hat brim where I'd pushed it back a dozen times working against the current. I stood on the bank with that coil of rope and I just breathed for a while. The river was coming back up. You could hear it if you knew what to listen for. A low sound, almost like wind but lower, the water filling the channels it had left behind. Another 20 minutes, maybe less, and the flat where I'd found her would have been 4 feet under. That was 11 years ago. I still hear that sound sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet. Her name was Cora Blaine. I didn't know that when I pulled her out. I didn't know anything about her except that her face was muddy to the hairline and her eyes were open, and she was looking at me like she'd already made her peace and was surprised it hadn't taken yet. I should back up. I was working a stretch of range along the Palouse River that season, fall of '81, maybe early '82. The years run together on that kind of work. Riding fence for a man named Aldercott who ran cattle on both sides of the river and had more acreage than sense about keeping track of it. The tidal flats down near the lower bend were a hazard even locals forgot about. The river dropped twice a day and left those gray-brown plates of silt sitting open to the sky, firm-looking from a distance, soft as cold grease underfoot. Cattle wandered out onto them sometimes, once in a while a horse. I'd pulled a steer off one of those flats 6 weeks before Cora. I knew exactly how fast the footing went from solid to nothing. That morning I was riding back from the east fence line, coming along the high bank above the lower bend, when I saw something I thought was a post. Pale, just the top of it showing above the flat, but posts don't move, and this thing moved, just barely, just enough. I put my horse down the bank before I'd thought it through. The flat was still mostly exposed. Low tide runs about 2.5 hours on that stretch before the water comes back, and I'd come in somewhere in the middle of it, which meant I had maybe an hour left before that mud was underwater. I got off my horse at the edge of the hard ground, because you can feel the difference before you can see it. There's a softness that comes into the ground, and it starts to take your boot heel in a way that sets off something in your gut if you've spent enough time near those places. I felt it at the edge. I left my horse there and went in on foot. She was in to her chin. That's not an exaggeration. I've told this story to men who thought I was rounding it up for effect, but I was not. The silt had her from the chin down. She'd gone in somewhere in the dark. I found out later, trying to cross to the east side where her homestead was, because the bridge upstream was washed out from the fall rains and she didn't know the flat. By the time I reached her, she'd been in it for somewhere close to 7 hours. 7 hours, standing in cold mud up to her chin in the gray light, waiting. She didn't make a sound when she saw me coming, I remember that. She watched me cross that flat. I was moving careful, testing every step, the mud sucking at my boots, and she just watched me come. No crying, no calling out. Her jaw was set and her eyes were steady, and she was tracking every foot I put down like she was counting them. I got to within about 12 feet of her, and felt the ground go soft enough to worry me. The silt gets worse the closer you get to where a person's gone in, because their going in has already disturbed it. I stopped. I said, "I'm going to get you out." She said, "I know." Just that. I went back to my horse, got the rope, came back and threw it to her. She caught it with her chin because her arms were pinned. I had to wade in another 2 feet to get it looped around her in a way that would hold without breaking something when I pulled. I was into my knees by then, feeling the cold of the mud through my jeans, feeling it try to take hold. I got the rope under her arms and knotted it best I could with numb fingers, and I walked it back to the edge of hard ground. My horse is a big roan gelding named Cutter. He's pulled stumps. He didn't flinch. Even so, it took 3 pulls. The silt doesn't let go in one clean movement. It releases in stages, and each stage she made a sound, not a cry, more like what comes out of a person when they've been holding their breath a long time and finally let it go. On the 3rd pull, she came free all at once, and I had her on the hard ground before the hole she'd left in the mud had stopped filling in with river water. She lay there on the bank for a long time. I got a blanket from my saddlebag and put it over her, and I sat down a few feet away and let her be. The river was already rising. We could both hear it. After a while she said, "You came across that flat like you knew what you were doing." I said I'd done it before. She said, "For a person." I told her no, for a steer. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell because her face was still mostly mud. Her homestead was 4 miles east. She had 40 acres, a cabin, a milk cow, and 2 horses. She'd been trying to work it alone since her husband died the spring before, a man named Blaine who'd come down with a chest sickness in February and was gone by April. She had no family within 300 miles. She'd been trying to make the fall work, get the last of her garden put up and the firewood in before snow, and she'd been losing ground. I didn't know any of that the morning I pulled her out. What I knew was that she needed to be warm and dry, and that my camp was closer than her homestead, and that she wasn't in any condition to sit a horse for 4 miles. I helped her up onto Cutter. She didn't weigh anything. The mud weighed more than she did. And I walked him back to my camp and got the fire going and made coffee and kept my back to her while she got out of the mud-soaked clothes and into the spare shirt and the wool blanket from my bedroll. She sat by the fire and drank the coffee, and I sat on the other side of it, and we didn't talk much for a while. What she said eventually was, "What's your name?" I told her Dill Hargett. She thought about that for a moment, the way you do when you're deciding whether a name suits a person. Then she said, "You any good at setting fence posts?" I told her I could set a fence post. She said her south pasture fence had been down since September, and she hadn't been able to get it up alone. I said I'd take a look at it. That was how it started. I want to be honest about what I was that fall. I was 51 years old. I'd been riding fence and doing hired work since I was 17, which is a long time to be the man someone else calls in when something needs fixing. I was good at my work, I knew that, and the men who hired me knew it, but knowing a thing about yourself and having it mean something to you are different problems. I'd had a wife once early on, a woman named Greta who died of a fever in the 3rd year of our marriage. We'd had a place of our own for those 3 years, and I'd known what it was to come home to something that was mine and have it mean something. After Greta, I went back to hired work because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And hired work has a way of filling up all the space that was meant for something else, if you let it. By the time I pulled Cora Blaine out of that riverbed, I had been the man other people called in for 30-some years. Good with horses, good with fence, good with cattle, good with the kind of quiet, steady work that keeps a place running. I didn't drink much. I didn't gamble. I wasn't mean to anyone. But I was the man who showed up, did the job, and rode on. Not because anyone asked me to ride on, but because staying had stopped feeling like a thing I was allowed to do. I don't know if a man can be lonely in a way he's stopped noticing. I think he can. I think you can get used to a certain kind of weight the same way you get used to a bad knee. It's just there. It's the weather you live in. You stop expecting it to change. Cora's south fence took me 2 days. When I was done, she asked if I'd look at her roof. One of the ridgepole braces had cracked, and the whole north end was soft. I looked at the roof, fixed it 3 days. Then there was the firewood. She'd gotten maybe a third of what she needed stacked. Winter was 6 weeks out, maybe less. I stayed for the firewood. I told myself it was the practical thing. A woman alone, 40 acres, winter coming. I told myself any decent man would stay and finish the wood before riding on. But I cut more wood than she needed. I split it fine, the way you do when you're not in a hurry. I stacked it tight and deep under the lean-to until the lean-to was full, and I started a second stack against the east wall of the cabin. Cora came out one afternoon and looked at the second stack and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's a lot of wood for one woman." I said winters up here ran long. She looked at me. She had a way of looking at a person, not suspicious, not measuring, just direct, like she was interested in what she was seeing. "You got somewhere you need to be?" she said. I thought about Aldercott's fence. I'd been 3 weeks off it already. "Not particularly," I said. "Then there's a bunk in the barn," she said. "Clean, stays warmer than you'd think. You can have it as long as you're useful." I said I tended to be useful. She said, "I know. That's why I'm offering." There are people who show kindness like it costs them something, like they're handing over a coin they'd rather keep. And there are people who just do what makes sense to them and don't make a production of it. Cora was the second kind. She didn't fuss over me. She didn't thank me constantly in that way that starts to feel like you're being managed. She just treated me like a man who was there, doing work that needed doing. And she did her own work alongside me, and we shared meals and talked in the evenings, and she didn't make it complicated. Nobody had treated me that straightforwardly in a long time. I don't mean to say she was cold. She wasn't cold. She'd laugh at things, quick and unguarded, usually something small, the way a chicken refused to move off the step, the particular face a horse makes when it's being asked to do something it finds undignified. And she'd get quiet sometimes, the way a person does when they're carrying something, and I learned not to push at those times. She'd come back out of it on her own. She was strong in a real way, not a performed way. 40 acres alone for 7 months will either break a person or it won't, and it hadn't broken her, but it had worn her. I could see that. The place was held together, but it was held together the way something is when one person has been doing the work of two for a long time, everything functional, nothing more than functional. I started doing the more than functional things, not because she asked, because they were there to do. I rehung 2 doors that were dragging on their hinges. I patched the gap under the cabin floor where the cold got in. I replaced 3 window frame boards that had rotted and were letting in draft. These were not big jobs, half a day each, most of them. But they were the kind of jobs that a woman alone has to let go because there's always something more urgent, always an animal that needs feeding, always a fence that's down, always the wood to cut. The small comfort things are the first things to not get done. The first morning the cabin held heat the way it was supposed to. Cora stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and was quiet for a long time. She said, I'd forgotten what it felt like when the floor wasn't cold. She didn't make anything out of it. Neither did I, but I heard it. I wrote to Aldercott in November, told him I wasn't coming back to his fence. He wrote back and said he understood, which surprised me, and that if I ever needed a reference, I had one. I appreciated that. I didn't tell Cora I'd written. She didn't ask. By November, we had the place in good shape. Winter came hard that year, earlier than anyone expected. Snow in the 2nd week of November, which is early for that country, and cold that stayed. The cattle herd she had, 8 head, needed extra management, and we fell into a rhythm of it together. Morning chores, midday, evening, the way any working place develops its rhythms. She knew her animals. She had a feel for them I respected. She'd tell me things: that particular cow was prone to going off feed when stressed, that the bay gelding needed his right front watched in cold weather because of an old tendon. And she said these things matter-of-factly, not like she was instructing me, but like she was thinking out loud and trusted me to be listening. I listened. One night in December, cold, the kind of cold where the window glass beads with ice on the inside and the wood in the stove pops, we were sitting after supper and she was mending a shirt of mine. I hadn't asked her to. She just picked it up and started on it. I was watching her hands, the way she set the stitch, and I had a feeling I didn't know what to do with. Not a young man's feeling. Something older and quieter than that. The feeling that something is exactly right, the lamplight, the sound of the fire, the mending, the cold outside. And you know it is, and you're afraid to move in case you disturb it. She looked up. I looked at the fire. She said, Dill. I looked at her. She said, I want you to know that I know what you've done here, not just the fence and the wood and the doors. I mean what you've done. She kept her eyes on mine. I was going under when you found me, not just in that riverbed. I was going under all over, and I know you stayed because you saw that. I didn't say anything. She said, I'm not going to be foolish about this. You're not a young man, and I'm not a young woman, and we've both lost people, and we know what things cost. So I'm not going to make more of it than it is. But what it is, what you are, I want you to know I see it. I do. I looked at the fire for a while. My throat was tight in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I said, that means something. She said, I know it does. She went back to the mending. That's why I said it. We were married in April after the snow. A circuit preacher came through, and we had him do it with Aldercott as one witness and a neighbor woman named Purvis as the other. It wasn't a long ceremony. The preacher had 2 more stops before nightfall, and the day was cold. Afterward, Purvis cried, which surprised everyone, including Purvis. Cora and I walked back to the cabin from the barn where we'd done it, because the barn was bigger and warmer, and she put her arm through mine on the way. The ground was wet from the snowmelt, soft in the low places, and the willows along the east fence line were just starting to come green. She was wearing a dark green dress she'd made herself over the winter. Secretly, I found out, working on it in the evenings when I was out doing the last chores. And she had her hair done up in a way she didn't usually, a small thing, but I noticed it. I said, you look like something worth finding. She looked at me sideways. You always talk like that. I said I didn't, usually. She said, then I'll take it. She tightened her arm in mine, and we walked the rest of the way without talking. The willows moved a little in the wind. A meadowlark was going somewhere in the field to the south. That long note it has, and the mud smell of the thaw was in everything, cold and green at the same time, the way spring smells when it means it. I have been on this land 11 years now. It's ours, not hers, not mine, the deed has both names. I put that fence up. I set those posts. I know every weak corner and every solid stretch. In 11 years it hasn't gone down once. The cattle herd is 31 head now. We run them well. I know which cow gives the most trouble in the fall, and I know the bay geldings right front, and I know which stretch of the Palouse is tidal flat and which is solid ground. And I know it the way a man knows the place he lives, bone deep, the back of the hand. People ask me sometimes, the men who knew me in the hired work years, how I ended up here. How a man who'd been moving his whole life stopped moving. I say a woman wouldn't let me leave. They laugh because they think that's a joke. It's not entirely a joke. The truth is simpler and harder to explain, which is that I'd been the man other people called in for so long I'd forgotten there was a version of me that a place belonged to, that a piece of ground could be mine, that the work I did could build something that was still there the next morning, and the morning after, and that the person beside me at the end of the day would be there in the morning because she'd chosen to be, not because she was paying me. Cora chose, she does it every day. Not in a way she makes a production of she's not built that way, but it's in how she is, how she talks to me, how she trusts me with the things she worries about, how she argues with me when she thinks I'm wrong and doesn't apologize for it, and how she stands with me when we're in the wrong together, which happens. I was the man who showed up, did the job, and rode on. I don't do that anymore. There are mornings here, cold mornings usually, with the light coming in flat across the field and the frost still on the grass, when I walk out to the east fence and I can hear the river. Not loud, just present the way the river is, that low sound it makes in the channels when the tide is coming back. I stand at the fence and I listen to it, not afraid, not the way I was that morning on the flat with the rope in my hands and the mud trying to take my boots and the water rising behind me, just listening. Cora comes out sometimes and stands beside me. She doesn't ask what I'm listening to. She's figured that out by now. She puts her hand through my arm, the way she did on our wedding day, and we stand there together and the river does what rivers do and the frost melts off the grass, and the meadowlarks start up somewhere out past the south fence, and the day begins. That's the solid ground. That's all it ever was.